very proud to and pleased to welcome to the stage Reverend Dr. Katharine Henderson. Thank you.
It's great to be with all of you here, and I hear that there was some fine dancing last night that I missed. I think Emma Goldman said, if there's no dancing at a revolution, I don't want to be there. So evidently you all were dancing in style. So next time we'll be dancing together. The topic of money and politics can seem far removed and theoretical until you realize how deeply it impacts the lives of everyday people. The mother in Flint, Michigan, who can't access fresh water to quench the thirst of her children. Immigrants who are rounded up to fulfill bed quotas needed to make the bottom line in private prison systems. Or the family whose brother was killed by gun violence who want to join with over 83% of the American public, including NRA members, to push through gun legislation to strengthen background checks, but can't because of the outsized influence and money of the NRA. The inability of citizens to change the things that matter most in their daily lives is at the heart of this election season that has gone rogue. Likewise, the matter of faith can seem distant from money and politics, but I want to remind us that faith is also about people and systems, about how we create a world of human flourishing where difference is celebrated and abundance is shared and people are hopeful working together for a future that's better than today. If you deeply believe, as I do, that all people are made equal, I would say in God's image, then as a matter not only of principle, but of simple consistency, our democratic systems have to serve all people equally. Civil rights activist and public theologian Ruby Sales describes how the forces of faith and democracy were woven together in her young life. She says, "I grew up in the South and I was bred on black folks' religion. It was a religion that combined the ideals of American democracy with a theological sense of justice. It was a religion that said that people who were considered property and disposable were essential in the eyes of God and even essential in a democracy, although we were enslaved. And it was religion where the language and symbols were accessible, even to 7-year-olds like me. And everybody in the community had access to the theological microphone." End of quote. This means that religion in that movement moment functioned not just in the prophetic speech of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who spoke to us from a Birmingham jail offering a public vision, inspiring us with moral language for an equitable future. But faith also nourished that little 7-year-old girl, Ruby. It shaped the character and her identity and forged the way for her to become the activist that she is even in our time. So I think that faith works in much the same way for us as we approach our work and to claim our democracy in this moment as we grapple with money and politics. Faith grounds us with a tantalizing vision and the possibility of human freedom that God intends for all of us. A future that could be but isn't yet. We can almost sometimes see it. Faith compels us to mend the gaps, as the prophet Isaiah would say, to be repairers of the breach and restorers of streets to live in. That's the language. And what that means is that we have to fix the system. This vision, by the way, is contested right now and thwarted by those who would secure great benefits for the few at the expense of the many. Faith offers us resilience to get people of courage like any of us in this room going when the going gets rough. And let's just say we all know that the going can get rough. Ruby Sales speaks of this resilience. She says, religion for me growing up in Columbus, Georgia, in its apartheid segregated reality, was the ground that I stood on that positioned us to stand against the wind, Faith positions people to sustain the hard work of justice for the long haul beyond any election season and any political project. We are in this for the long haul. So for me and for many of you, the civil rights movement was clearly only one part of a much longer project that we are continuing in right now with this work on money and politics. And finally, without being too transactional, it's about numbers. Whether they associate with organized religion or not, 75 to 80% of Americans profess some kind of faith in God. There are some 300,000 faith-rooted organizations in this country representing millions of constituents who can be activated and organized. It's fair to say that without finding a way to spark the moral imagination of people of faith on Amendment 8 or on any other public issue, it won't be successful. Now, I want to share with you the story of how an almost 200-year-old institution, Auburn Seminary, and by the way, we are not the Auburn in the South with a football team. We are the Auburn in New York City. Sometimes I have to remind people of that. But anyway, we went to Congress with a white paper on money and politics, if you can believe it. Our work today at Auburn is to equip leaders of faith and moral courage, Christians, Jews, Muslims, Sikhs, Buddhists. So it's a big tent to work on issues of justice, to create a lively, multivocal, multi-faith that includes humanists too, conversation in the public square, and to get stuff done to heal and repair the world. So that's the beauty of my work. So in 2012, Auburn was asked to train faith leaders who were working with money in politics campaigns in Montana and Colorado because both states had ballot initiatives calling for a constitutional amendment. Initially, we were working especially with white evangelicals, and the messaging offered by secular organizations didn't work for many of them. There were no faith-rooted messages. Evangelicals in particular really needed to hear that this public issue actually had something to do with their faith. And so we decided that we would try to figure this out. We commissioned 10 theologians, evangelical, Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish traditions, and we challenged them. We said, does faith, do our texts, do our sacred texts, do our traditions have anything to say about this issue of money and politics? And the end result was a report that all of you can read, Losing Faith in Our Democracy, a theological critique of the role of money in politics, which offers important moral and ethical frames to support this issue. The report became the basis of a bipartisan congressional hearing in 2014, sponsored by Democrat John Sarbanes and Republican Tom Petrie, who concluded that this issue is not just political, but deeply moral and ethical. We discovered along the way that people of faith have a lot at stake in this national debate and are ready to be engaged. So here's just a taste of what we found. There was a consensus among the contributors of the report that we have to pay attention to the needs of the people who are poor, and that by all moral standards, we are failing that test. And let's just say there has been so little talk about poverty in this election season. Theologian William Kavanaugh focused on Catholic social teaching of the preferential option for the poor by saying, quote, "From a Christian point of view, the fact that the voice of the wealthy is the voice that is most clearly and forcefully heard is an upside-down state of affairs. For it's precisely the voice of the poor and the weak and the vulnerable that must be clearly heard. To defend the cause of the poor, one must know their concerns, and to know their concerns, their voice must be heard." End of quote. The Catholic bishops emphasize that the Bible is not talking about charity for people who are poor in a kind of paternalistic way, but the active participation of the most vulnerable among us, the most marginalized in political life. The poor have wisdom to share and a contribution to make to shape the common good. So this is one thing that we found, to focus on the poor. Evangelicals in the report pointed out how far our political life has strayed from this standard and vision by citing a passage from the Gospel of Luke. Here's this little story. Jesus says, when you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, in case they might invite you in return and therefore be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. So some evangelical Christians with that text were asking, how often, and this is a good question, do the poor and disenfranchised get invited to parties, dinner parties with candidates to talk about the issues that affect their lives the most? Not often. Jewish theologians offered a rabbinic approach to address the undue influence of money, recognizing that larger donors inevitably garner greater influence. To presume otherwise is simply naive. So systems are needed to level the playing field to ensure that all are represented. Without a counterbalance, the lopsided influence of the wealthy will inevitably break the system, which is what we are all about here today. And I would say that it's a system that's not good for anybody, including those who are wealthy. It's not good for any of us. Putting this theologically and biblically, many of us would say that the voice of God can be heard in the people. The voice of God can be heard in the people. In Latin, it's vox populi, vox Dei. So God is actually calling to us, communicating with us through the cries of the people. Political theorists are going to argue that the entire democratic process is based on the free and robust exchange of ideas between people. So since 75 to 80% of Americans identify on a spectrum as spiritual to religious, much of our public discourse is somehow faith-based, whether it's implicit or not. So when you quash the deliberation of this people, this great democratic process, and all of these voices in the public square, you are actually silencing the voice of God. In a Citizens United context, many of us have deep concerns about treating corporations as people, for this demeans the very idea of God-given personhood. Our contributors use several theological principles to make this point, that people, not corporations, are made in the image of God, that people, not entities, are responsible for their actions. As one theologian puts it, the only way for truth to be served, and thus the possibility of a just political society, is for people to be held accountable for their speaking and acting. Such accountability is missing when the corporation is considered a person whose donations are considered speech. Rabbi Ari Clapper explains that because a corporation is obligated by law to maximize its profit, pursuing its own self-interest, it's rendered incapable of fairly weighing competing values like self-interest versus communal interest, corporate profit versus the common good. And this process of weighing values and interest is at the very heart and essence of what ethics is all about. You have to be able to weigh these things. Only human beings can do that. And finally, the contributors of the report insist that any notion of justice has to include consideration of fair economic outcomes and consequences, not just fair procedures. The question is always, where do these procedures lead? So that every person can have access to the productive resources of society and the dignity of being a member of the society. So that's just a short overview. You can read the longer yourself, but there are ample, and I'm concluding now, faith-rooted views about the grave dangers inherent in the current trajectory of our country, where mega donors and super PACs and corporations exert undue influence on the electoral process and silence the voices not only of the most vulnerable and those on the margins, but in some ways the vast majority of all of us. When this happens, our collective moral judgment is distorted and skewed. It leads to bad policies, and democracy itself hangs in the balance. And I think we're already seeing the fallout in this election cycle, where many on all sides feel left out of the process, left behind, forgotten that the system is really against them. I saw the cards that said the system is rigged, and in some ways they are actually right. Remember the mother in Flint trying to find water for her children, the teacher, the policeman, the immigrant, the recent graduate who can't find a job, the worker struggling for a minimum wage. It's you and me and all the people we love and care about. It's really about all of us. So much is at stake. So as an American and as a faith leader, I urge you to see people of faith as allies and partners and in this fight for democracy. Only together we will win. I really believe that, and I bet you do too. At its best, this movement, I think, could be an awakening. Religious folks are all about awakenings. I think this could be an awakening moment of the populace and a way for those left out to be brought in. And so I'm going to leave you with the words of the prophet Nelson Mandela, who said, "It always seems impossible until it's done." So let's go and do this thing together. Thank you.